Hollywood has always been a place where dreams glitter under the scorching spotlight. But behind every glowing marquee lies a darker truth. Among the countless names that once lit up the silver screen, few stories are as haunting and as tragically forgotten as that of Carole Landis. She was called the Blonde Bombshell, a radiant beauty with golden hair and a smile that could melt any producer's heart. In the 1940s, she seemed destined for greatness, appearing alongside major stars, adored by soldiers during World War II, and gracing magazine covers as the new face of Hollywood glamour. But Hollywood's promises are rarely kept. For Carole, the fairy tale was built on fragile glass, hiding fractures of loneliness, rejection, and scandal. While audiences saw an angel with emerald gowns and dazzling eyes, behind closed doors she was a woman fighting battles that no studio contract could erase. Her story is not just one of ambition and success, it is also one of love affairs that ended in betrayal, the burden of being treated as a beautiful commodity rather than an artist, and a relentless pressure to keep smiling even as her world collapsed. On July 5, 1948, at the age of only 29, Carole Landis was found dead in her Hollywood home. Official reports called it suicide, but whispers told of a secret relationship with a powerful actor, Rex Harrison, and the cruel reality that Hollywood would rather bury her truth than tarnish a man's reputation. Tonight, we step into the life of the woman known as the angel Hollywood forgot, a star whose flame burned too brightly, too briefly, and left behind a legacy of unanswered questions. Carole Landis was not born into the shimmering world of Hollywood. Her real name was Frances Lillian Mary Ridstey, and she entered the world on January 1, 1919, in the small town of Fairchild, Wisconsin. From the very beginning, her life was shaped by a tension between light and shadow. Her father, Alfred Ridstey, abandoned the family when Carole was still a child, leaving her mother, Clara, to raise Carole and her 5 siblings in poverty. For the young girl who would later be celebrated as a goddess of beauty, her earliest memories were of hunger, cold winters, and the shame of being unwanted. Carole's mother struggled to keep food on the table, often working menial jobs while moving the children from place to place. Poverty, however, became the crucible that hardened Carole's resilience. From a very young age, she was forced to grow up quickly. Teachers and neighbors would later recall her restless energy, her need to perform, to sing, to dance, even if her stage was nothing more than a makeshift floor in a small farmhouse. She learned early that her smile could win people over, and that behind the smile, she could hide her fear and longing. By her teenage years, Carole had already begun to dream of escape. She looked at magazines with glamorous Hollywood stars and imagined herself on the covers. She was fascinated by actresses like Jean Harlow and Clara Bow, women who had transformed themselves from ordinary backgrounds into shimmering icons. Carole knew she had something that could set her apart, her striking beauty. Even in a town where everyone knew everyone else, she stood out, the tall girl with golden hair and an aura of confidence that seemed far older than her years. But her family life remained unstable. Her mother's remarriages created more conflict, and Carole felt increasingly suffocated by the poverty and dysfunction around her. At the age of just 15, desperate for freedom, she dropped out of high school. Not long after, she impulsively married a local man, Irving Wheeler, in 1934. She was only 15, and he was 19. It was an act of rebellion, a way to prove that she could take control of her own destiny. Yet the marriage, predictably, lasted only a few weeks before being annulled. Still, that bold, reckless step revealed something essential about Carole. She would never let circumstances dictate her future. She saved every dollar she could, working odd jobs as a waitress and singer in small clubs, until she managed to make her way westward. By 1937, with barely enough money in her pocket, she boarded a bus to California. She was 17 years old, carrying nothing but ambition and a determination to be seen. When Carole arrived in Los Angeles, Hollywood was in its golden age. The studios were vast kingdoms, and the movie stars were worshipped like royalty. But for every star that shone on the screen, there were thousands of hopeful young women arriving with the same dream, only to be swallowed up by the system. Carole knew the odds, but she also knew she had the kind of beauty that made men turn their heads in silence. At first, she struggled. She posed for pin-up photos, took small modeling gigs, and endured endless rejections from casting directors. Sometimes, she would be offered roles that amounted to nothing more than standing in the background as an extra. But Carole was determined not to fade into obscurity. She studied herself in the mirror, perfected her smile, and worked tirelessly to learn how to control the camera's gaze. Her big break came in the late 1930s when she was discovered performing at a San Francisco nightclub. Studio scouts noticed the tall, blonde girl with the magnetic presence, and soon she was given a chance to sign small contracts. To reinvent herself, Frances Ridgely became Carole Landis, a name she borrowed in honor of her idol Carole Lombard, another blonde star who embodied charm and independence. This transformation was more than just a name change, it was a declaration. Frances Ridgely, the poor girl from Wisconsin, was gone. In her place was Carole Landis, a woman who would conquer Hollywood. But inside, the scars of her early life, poverty, abandonment, and instability remained. They gave her both her hunger for success and her vulnerability to heartbreak. The years that followed would see her rise through Hollywood's machinery, navigating both triumph and exploitation. She was adored by soldiers during World War II, who pinned her photos to their barracks walls, calling her the girl with the golden hair. Yet behind the glamour, Carole carried the weight of her origins, the small-town girl who had learned to survive by smiling, even when she wanted to cry. Her childhood had taught her two lessons that would define her adult life. The first was that beauty could be her weapon, her passport out of obscurity. The second was far more dangerous, that love and stability could be taken away at any moment. These lessons would follow her, shaping every decision, every relationship, and ultimately leading her down a path where fame could not protect her from despair. Carole Landis was now in Hollywood, ready to play the role of a lifetime. But the ghosts of Wisconsin, the cold nights of hunger, and the shadow of being abandoned by her father would never truly leave her. They lingered in her, unseen by audiences who only saw the angelic smile. And as her story unfolded, those shadows would grow darker until they consumed the light. Hollywood in the late 1930s and early 1940s was a kingdom of dreams, and Carole Landis, still barely out of her teens, was determined to carve out her place within it. She had already remade herself name, style, and persona, and now she set out to prove that she was more than just another pretty face arriving on the studio lot. Yet, for all the promise that shimmered around her, her journey would be one of constant negotiation between recognition and rejection, between the spotlight and the shadows. Carole's earliest film appearances were modest, little more than background roles. In 1937, she appeared as an uncredited dancer in A Star is Born, a cruel irony considering her own story would echo the film's themes of ambition and heartbreak. She was also cast in brief walk-on parts in a handful of productions so brief that few audiences even noticed her. For most girls, these scraps of exposure would have been discouraging, but Carole treated every moment on set as an education. She watched the great stars at work, studied their poise, and absorbed the mechanics of filmmaking. She was preparing, quietly but deliberately, for her breakthrough. That breakthrough came in 1940, when she landed a small but striking role in 1,000,000 B.C. Cast as a prehistoric cavewoman alongside Victor Mature, Carole captivated audiences with her exotic costumes, statuesque figure, and undeniable screen presence. The film itself was little more than a spectacle, but it made her a name to remember. Audiences didn't care about the plot, they cared about the blonde goddess who seemed to leap out of the Stone Age and into their imaginations. Almost overnight, Carole Landis became a recognized face. Studios, eager to capitalize on her beauty, began offering her more roles. She starred in adventure films, comedies, and musicals. Topper Returns, 1941, showcased her comedic charm, proving she could be more than just decoration on screen. Moon Over Miami, 1941, placed her alongside established stars like Betty Grable, where she held her own with surprising confidence. These roles elevated her status, and for a brief period, It seemed as though Carole was on the path to becoming one of Hollywood's next big leading ladies. But Carole's greatest fame would not come from the screen alone. With America's entry into World War II, Hollywood mobilized its stars to boost morale among the troops. Carole threw herself into this mission with extraordinary dedication. She performed tirelessly for soldiers, singing, dancing, and speaking with them face to face. She traveled extensively on USO tours, visiting bases across the United States and abroad. Her warmth and accessibility made her beloved among servicemen. They affectionately nicknamed her the soldier's sweetheart. Unlike some stars who kept a careful distance, Carole shook hands, wrote personal notes, and stayed late after shows to speak with the men. For soldiers far from home, she became a symbol of kindness, beauty, and hope. This period cemented her popularity in a way no studio could manufacture. Her pin-up photos adorned barracks, walls, and letters poured in by the thousands. Carole's patriotism and generosity were genuine, but they also masked the private struggles that simmered beneath her public image. Her career was rising, yet she still felt the constant pressure of Hollywood's ruthless competition. Studio executives often typecast her in roles that emphasized her beauty rather than her range as an actress. Privately, Carole wrestled with feelings of inadequacy. She wanted to be seen as a serious performer, but her roles often reduced her to the glamorous blonde archetype. She read voraciously, studied drama, and pushed for more substantial parts. Yet producers hesitated. Hollywood had a cruel way of slotting actresses into categories, and once placed, it was nearly impossible to break free. For Carole, who craved depth and recognition, this was both frustrating and wounding. Yet, she refused to fade. In 1942, she appeared in I Wake Up Screaming, a noir thriller that revealed new facets of her talent. Critics praised her performance, noting that she brought vulnerability and intensity to the role. It was a glimpse of what Carole could achieve if given the chance. Still, the industry continued to box her in. As World War II dragged on, her film opportunities slowed, and by the mid-1940s, she found herself caught in a cycle of secondary roles while newer faces began to dominate the screen. Carole's journey in Hollywood was not just professional, it was also deeply personal. Her beauty and charisma attracted powerful men, and she became entangled in a series of high-profile relationships and marriages. Each, however, seemed to mirror the instability of her early life. She married 4 times, yet none of the unions lasted. Behind the glamour, she yearned for stability, for love that would not vanish like her father had when she was a child. The combination of fading career prospects and personal turmoil weighed heavily on her. While she remained adored by soldiers and loyal fans, she was acutely aware of Hollywood's fickle nature. Stars who burned brightly could be discarded just as quickly. By 1946, her career had slowed dramatically, and roles that once seemed abundant began to dry up. Carole tried to reinvent herself, taking on theater roles, considering work abroad, but the momentum she had once enjoyed was slipping away. Still, Carole fought to remain relevant. She hosted charity events, stayed active in Hollywood circles, and continued to appear in films, though often in supporting parts. Her resilience was undeniable, but so was the toll of disappointment. She was a woman who had climbed out of poverty, reinvented herself into a star, and given her heart to her country's soldiers. Yet she found herself struggling to hold on to the dream that had brought her to California as a teenager. By the late 1940s, Carole's journey had reached a crossroads. She was still stunning, still capable of captivating audiences, but Hollywood was shifting. Younger stars were emerging, and the studios had little patience for actresses who were no longer at the center of attention. Carole, once hailed as the Blonde Bombshell, was now battling invisibility in an industry that thrived on the new and the sensational. Her rise had been swift, her journey remarkable, but the cracks were visible. She had the beauty, the charm, and the heart of a true star, but Hollywood, as it so often does, was preparing to move on. And Carole Landis, the girl who had escaped poverty to conquer the silver screen, was about to face her most difficult act yet: the slow, painful decline from stardom into obscurity. By the early 1940s, Carole Landis had reached the zenith of her career. She had transformed from a small-town girl with nothing but ambition into a Hollywood star whose name appeared on marquees across the nation. while she never quite joined the ranks of the industry's untouchable legends. For a fleeting period she was everywhere, her face on posters, her voice in theaters, her figure gracing the barracks walls of soldiers fighting overseas. For Carole, this was the closest she would come to having it all. And yet, even at the height of her success, shadows lingered on the horizon. Her career's high point came with Moon Over Miami, 1941. Cast alongside Betty Grable and Donna Mae. Carole sparkled as the vivacious younger sister, her radiant beauty and comedic timing winning over audiences and critics alike. The film was a box-office hit, and Carole suddenly found herself in the same conversation as Grable, Alice Faye, and other stars of the era. The studio promoted her heavily, eager to turn her into their next big moneymaker. Publicity campaigns splashed her across magazines, dressing her in dazzling gowns, placing her on exotic beaches, and proclaiming her as Hollywood's new blonde sensation. At the same time, Topper Returns, 1941, cemented her comedic credibility. Playing a glamorous but doomed heiress who becomes a ghost, Carole charmed audiences with her mix of wit, warmth, and allure. Unlike many bombshell roles of the era, the part allowed her to show personality beyond just beauty. Critics noted her charisma, and studio bosses began to envision her as a versatile performer. It was during these years that Carole began to believe her dreams were within reach, that she could move beyond typecasting and become a genuine leading lady with longevity. The war years pushed her fame to even greater heights. No other star was as devoted to the troops as Carole Landis. She didn't just pose for pinup photographs. She was there, in person, traveling tirelessly to military bases, performing shows, signing autographs, and, most importantly, listening. Soldiers adored her not only for her looks but for her humanity. She would sit with the wounded, hold their hands, and write letters to their families. For many, she was a beacon of warmth in a world torn apart by violence. Her USO tours took her around the globe, and she often put herself in dangerous situations to be near the troops. She toured Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, sometimes falling ill, sometimes enduring exhausting schedules, but always continuing. At one point, she collapsed from malaria, contracted during a tour, yet resumed performing after recovery. The press hailed her as a heroine, and the soldiers' devotion to her grew even deeper. She became known as the soldier's sweetheart, a title that, in some ways, meant more to her than anything Hollywood offered. Back in Los Angeles, however, the story was more complicated. Though Carole's popularity was undeniable, the studio system was fickle. 20th Century Fox, where she was under contract, often seemed unsure what to do with her. While she delivered consistent performances, the studio never fully committed to pushing her as their #1 star. Betty Grable remained their golden girl, and Carole was often relegated to second-tier roles, no matter how luminous she appeared on screen. Carole fought back in subtle ways. She demanded better scripts, pushed for roles that would challenge her, and refused to be dismissed as merely ornamental. In interviews, she spoke candidly about her desire for substance. Yet, Hollywood, with its rigid categories, resisted. To them, Carole was the quintessential blonde bombshell, perfect for light comedies, musicals, or romances, but rarely considered for dramas or prestigious projects. Despite these frustrations, Carole's fame reached its pinnacle in the mid-1940s. She was invited to countless premieres, feted at glamorous parties, and adored by the public. Her style and figure were emulated by women across America, and she became a fashion icon, known for her curves and sophistication. She appeared in I Wake Up Screaming, 1941, one of the earliest examples of film noir, showcasing her ability to handle darker material. Though not the headliner, her performance was widely praised, proving she had depth that few recognized. During these years, Carole also explored writing. She penned a book titled Four Jills in a Jeep, 1944, recounting her experiences entertaining troops overseas. The book was adapted into a film, with Carole playing herself alongside fellow actresses Kay Francis, Martha Raye, and Mitzi Mayfair. It was a project that highlighted her patriotism and her dedication to the men she entertained. Few actresses of the era had such a direct connection between their screen persona and their real-world heroism. Personally, however, Carole's peak years were far less stable. Her romantic life was turbulent, marked by a series of failed marriages and affairs. She married 4 times, each union collapsing under the weight of mismatched expectations, infidelity, or incompatibility. Hollywood gossip columns feasted on her private life, reducing her struggles to sensational headlines. But behind the gossip was a woman, searching desperately for stability, a home, a family, and a love that would endure. During the war, she also engaged in a series of high-profile relationships, some with powerful men in Hollywood, others with military officers. Her romances kept her name in the papers, but none brought her the happiness she craved. The instability mirrored the abandonment she had felt as a child, and with each heartbreak, Carole grew more restless, more vulnerable to despair. Still, for the outside world, these years glittered. Carole Landis was glamorous, successful, and admired. She lived in a beautiful home in the Hollywood Hills, owned expensive gowns, and moved in elite circles. She was friends with stars like Betty Grable and Cesar Romero, and she seemed to embody the very idea of a Hollywood dream. To the soldiers overseas, she was perfection incarnate. To audiences in theaters, she was radiant. To journalists, she was a headline. But within the shimmering surface, the cracks deepened. Hollywood was beginning to shift, the war was ending, and new stars were rising. Carole's box office draw was slipping, and studio executives were turning their attention elsewhere. The roles that had once seemed abundant were fewer now, and Carole's determination to be taken seriously often clashed with an industry that valued youth and novelty over experience. Her peak, though dazzling, was precarious. She had reached the summit of fame but found that the summit was narrow and lonely. She was admired, desired, and adored, yet never quite secured the artistic respect she longed for. Worse, she could feel the inevitability of decline pressing upon her, as if Hollywood's machinery was already preparing to replace her. For Carole Landis, the height of her fame was not a plateau but a fragile tightrope, brilliant while it lasted, but always on the verge of collapse. And soon, the shadows that had followed her since childhood would return with a vengeance, pulling her down from the glittering heights into the depths of despair. By the mid-1940s, the glow that once surrounded Carole Landis began to dim. The Hollywood dream machine that had elevated her so swiftly was just as capable of discarding her when she no longer fit the mold. Though she had achieved popularity and genuine adoration from the public, especially from soldiers during the war, Carole now faced the brutal reality of fading opportunities, personal turmoil, and an industry that thrived on scandal as much as success. Her professional struggles became evident after World War II. With the soldiers returning home, and the wartime morale tours no longer in demand, Carole's unique niche, the soldier's sweetheart, lost its immediacy. Hollywood was already grooming new faces, younger actresses, who could step into the spotlight. Carole, still radiant in her late 20s, suddenly found herself competing with women barely out of their teens. Studio executives, fickle as ever, stopped pushing her as a headliner. Instead, she was offered fewer roles, many of them unworthy of her talent. Carole's determination to escape typecasting only deepened her struggles. She longed for challenging, dramatic roles, but the studio bosses saw her primarily as a blonde beauty, suited for musicals and comedies. Her attempts to reinvent herself were met with resistance, and gradually, the offers dwindled. She began taking roles in smaller productions and even turned to theater in an effort to prove her range. In London's West End, she starred in Piccadilly Incident alongside Rex Harrison, who would soon become a pivotal figure in her downfall. The personal side of her life, always tumultuous, now became a source of constant pain. Carole's marriages had all ended in disappointment, each one leaving her with deeper wounds. Her longing for stability, for a lasting partnership, remained unfulfilled. She moved through relationships that often ended in betrayal, reinforcing the sense of abandonment that had haunted her since childhood. Hollywood gossip columns fed on these dramas, portraying her as unlucky in love, but rarely acknowledging the emotional toll it took. By the late 1940s, Carole's name was appearing in newspapers less for her work and more for her personal entanglements. The most consequential of these was her secret affair with Rex Harrison, a British actor married at the time to actress Lily Palmer. Their relationship was intense and, for Carole, deeply serious. She believed he might leave his wife for her, offering the stability and love she had sought all her life. But Harrison was cautious, unwilling to risk scandal in a world where an affair could ruin his carefully constructed reputation. The affair consumed Carole. Friends later recalled that she invested herself entirely in the relationship, ignoring the warning signs that Harrison was unlikely to commit. She was vulnerable, desperate for love, and increasingly isolated as her career faltered. Hollywood was merciless with women who stepped outside the boundaries of propriety, and whispers of her relationship with Harrison only fueled the perception that she was unstable, a liability. Meanwhile, Carole's health began to suffer under the strain of her disappointments. She battled depression, a condition poorly understood in her time, and often dismissed as weakness. The glamorous photographs that appeared in magazines showed her smiling, radiant, flawless. But behind the lens, she was struggling with feelings of worthlessness and despair. Friends noticed her mood swings, her exhaustion, her inability to find joy in the things that once energized her. She sought help in the form of doctors and medications, but the treatments of the era were crude and ineffective. Hollywood itself added to her decline. The studios, which had once celebrated her, now distanced themselves. She was no longer considered bankable, and casting directors quietly moved on to newer stars. Carole felt the sting of rejection acutely. For someone who had built her identity on being wanted first as a daughter, then as a wife, then as a star, the growing invisibility was unbearable. She tried to revive her career by taking roles abroad and exploring new opportunities, yet each effort seemed to fall short of the comeback she envisioned. By 1947, she was appearing less on screen and more in gossip columns. Her once bright star reduced to fading echoes. The defining blow came in her relationship with Rex Harrison. As their affair deepened, Carole pressured him to leave his wife, believing that they could build a future together. Harrison, however, refused. The rejection devastated her. Friends recalled that she became increasingly despondent, speaking often of her loneliness and sense of failure. She felt trapped, too famous to disappear into anonymity, too forgotten to reclaim her place in Hollywood, too in love with a man who would never publicly claim her. In the weeks leading up to her death, Carole's despair grew more visible. She confided in close friends that she felt her life was spiraling out of control. On July 4, 1948, she attended a party at Harrison's home. According to reports, the evening ended in tension, with Carole pleading for him to reconsider his refusal to leave his wife. The next day, she was found dead in her Hollywood home, a bottle of Seconal pills nearby. She was only 29 years old. The official cause of death was ruled suicide. Yet rumors swirled immediately. Some claimed she had been abandoned by Harrison in her most vulnerable moment. Others whispered about Hollywood's silent complicity, the way the industry swept inconvenient women aside. To many, the timing of her death, so soon after the confrontation with Harrison, was too suspicious to ignore. The scandal rocked Hollywood, but it was quickly contained. Studios had no interest in prolonging the story. Harrison, shielded by his status, continued his career with little repercussion. Carole, meanwhile, was remembered in fleeting headlines as another Hollywood tragedy, her life reduced to gossip and speculation. The woman who had once been adored by soldiers, who had written heartfelt letters to the wounded, who had embodied glamour and generosity, was gone. Her legacy eclipsed by scandal. Her collapse was not just personal, it was systemic. Carole Landis was a casualty of Hollywood's unforgiving machinery, a star who shone brightly but was never fully embraced by the system. Her beauty made her a sensation, but her vulnerability made her disposable. In an industry that celebrated illusions, Carole's reality proved too fragile, too human, to survive. The dark side of her story was not merely the affair, nor the suicide. It was the way Hollywood and society at large treated women like her, as ornaments to be adored when useful, discarded when inconvenient. Carole Landis's collapse was, in many ways, inevitable in such a world. When news of Carole Landis's death broke on July 5, 1948, Hollywood woke to a shock that many pretended to be surprised by, but few were truly unprepared for. Tragedy had always lurked behind Carole's luminous smile, and those closest to her admitted, quietly, that the signs of despair had been visible long before that fateful night. Yet the suddenness of her passing, at only 29, jolted an industry already notorious for its cruelty toward women who failed to conform. Her body was discovered in her Brentwood home by none other than Rex Harrison, the man whose refusal to leave his wife had shattered Carole's fragile hope. Reports state that Harrison arrived early that morning after Carole had failed to appear for a scheduled lunch. The scene was grim. Carole lay motionless, a bottle of Seconal sleeping pills at her side, a note written in her distinctive handwriting on the bedside table. The note read like a farewell, short, unadorned. It expressed her exhaustion and despair. Some accounts suggest it contained words of apology to her mother, while others claim it was directed at Harrison himself. Whatever its true contents, the note crystallized the depth of her hopelessness. For Carole, who had once lived in the bright glare of Hollywood's golden lights, there was no way forward, only silence. The aftermath of her death was chaotic and tinged with suspicion. Officially, the coroner's report ruled it suicide by overdose. Yet speculation flourished. Why had Harrison, a married man with much to lose, been the first to find her? Why did the studio system move so swiftly to close the case, discouraging reporters from probing too deeply? Some whispered that Harrison had discovered her alive but failed to call for help quickly enough. Others suggested that the scandal was managed deliberately, shielding him while tarnishing her reputation as unstable and self-destructive. Hollywood had long mastered the art of damage control, and Carole's death was no exception. Within days, the press narrative was carefully shaped. Carole Landis, the blonde bombshell, had been fragile, unlucky in love, and tragically unable to cope with rejection. Her legacy was framed less as a testament to her talent and generosity, and more as another cautionary tale of a woman destroyed by her emotions. Rex Harrison, meanwhile, continued working with little consequence, his career virtually untouched by the scandal. Carole's funeral was a somber affair. Held at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, it drew hundreds of mourners, from Hollywood peers to loyal fans. Soldiers who had adored her during the war sent flowers, their heartfelt messages recalling how she had lifted their spirits in their darkest hours. Friends described the atmosphere as heavy, with both grief and disbelief. How could someone so vibrant, so giving, be gone so suddenly? Her casket was draped in white flowers, a reminder of the angelic persona she had carried throughout her life. Amid the grief, the practical realities of her last wishes surfaced. Carole left behind debts, the result of years of living lavishly. While her career declined, she had attempted to maintain the image of a glamorous star, even as roles dried up, and the financial strain was significant. In her will, she left her estate primarily to her mother, Clara, the woman who had struggled alongside her since childhood. Friends said Carole remained deeply devoted to her family, sending money home even during her leanest years. Yet her last will extended beyond financial matters. Carole had long expressed a desire to be remembered not just as a beautiful face, but as someone who gave of herself generously. Her book, 4 Jills in a Jeep, and her tireless work entertaining troops stood as part of that legacy. In personal letters discovered after her death, she often wrote about her wish to find meaning beyond stardom. "If I can make people happy," she once wrote, "maybe that is all the legacy I need." The press, however, was less charitable. Tabloids feasted on the sensational aspects of her death. Headlines emphasized the failed romance with Rex Harrison, the empty pill bottle, the desperation of a fading starlet. Rarely did they mention her selflessness with soldiers, or her struggle to be taken seriously as an actress. Hollywood had decided her narrative. Carole Landis was a beautiful woman, undone by her own emotions. Another sad footnote in the annals of fallen stars. In the months following her death, whispers of injustice persisted. Some colleagues believed she had been betrayed by the very industry that had profited from her beauty. Others accused Harrison, if not of direct wrongdoing, then at least of cold indifference. Yet as time passed, the scandal faded. Carole's films continued to play in theaters for a while, but newer stars soon overshadowed her memory. By the early 1950s, she was already being referred to as the forgotten angel, her once bright light dimmed by neglect. Still, Among those who had known her personally, her loss was profound. Friends remembered her kindness, her laughter, her fierce loyalty. Soldiers who had met her on USO tours never forgot her warmth. One veteran later said, "She made us feel human again, even for just an hour. That's what she gave us, and that's how I'll remember her." Carole's life and death raised uncomfortable questions about Hollywood's treatment of women. How many actresses had been celebrated for their beauty, while being denied real opportunities to grow as artists? How many were discarded once they no longer fit the image the studio wanted to project? Carole was not the first casualty, nor would she be the last. But her story became a striking example of how the system could elevate and then abandon with equal ruthlessness. Her last will, in its truest sense, was not about property or money. It was about memory. She had once written that she wanted to be remembered for my heart, not just my face. Yet Hollywood remembered her face, the blonde curls, the dazzling gowns, the wide smile that hid so much sadness. The heart, the woman behind the angel, was buried beneath layers of scandal and silence. The aftermath of her death was a study in contrasts. A woman mourned by those who truly knew her, exploited by an industry eager to erase its complicity, and remembered by history more for the manner of her death than the richness of her life. But her final act, leaving behind words, gestures, and memories that revealed her humanity, remained. Even in her absence, Carole Landis refused to be entirely forgotten. In the decades since her untimely death, Carole Landis has drifted between remembrance and obscurity, a star whose brilliance was undeniable, but whose story has often been overshadowed by scandal. To some, she remains a tragic footnote in Hollywood history. To others, she is emblematic of the countless women whose lives were consumed by the unforgiving machinery of fame. Her legacy is not as visible as that of her contemporaries, like Betty Grable or Rita Hayworth. Yet her life continues to echo, in subtle but profound ways. Her films, though not always counted among Hollywood's classics, still endure as artifacts of her era. Moon Over Miami, Topper Returns, and I Wake Up Screaming showcase her charisma and versatility, while Four Jills in a Jeep preserves her patriotism and generosity during the war. These works serve as glimpses of what she could have become if Hollywood had allowed her to evolve beyond typecasting. Viewers who rediscover her today often remark on her screen presence. Luminous yet approachable, glamorous yet grounded. She had the rare quality of making audiences feel that she was both an untouchable star and the girl next door. But her true legacy lies not only in her work, but in the way her life story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about Hollywood. Carole Landis embodied both the promise and the peril of the dream factory. She was proof that beauty and ambition could catapult a woman from obscurity to fame. But she was also proof that the system offered little protection when the spotlight dimmed. Hollywood celebrated her as long as she fit their narrative. And when she demanded more respect, more serious roles, more recognition, the system quietly closed its doors. Her treatment reflects the broader plight of actresses in the studio era. The system commodified women, elevating them as symbols of glamour but rarely allowing them agency. Carole's story reveals the price of challenging those boundaries: isolation, rejection, and ultimately, despair. In this sense, her life resonates with modern discussions of gender inequality and the exploitation of women in the entertainment industry. Long before the Me Too movement, Carole Landis's struggles illustrated how deeply these problems were embedded in Hollywood's foundations. The open questions surrounding her death remain central to her story. Officially, her suicide was attributed to depression and a broken heart. Yet speculation persists. Did Rex Harrison's rejection truly tip her over the edge, or was his involvement downplayed to protect his career? Could she have been saved if someone had intervened earlier? Did the industry's relentless pressure push her into an irreversible spiral? These questions linger not because they promise neat answers, but because they underscore the tragedy of a life cut short before resolution. Rex Harrison himself remained largely unscathed, his career flourishing in the decades that followed. He went on to star in My Fair Lady and became one of Britain's most celebrated actors. To many, this imbalance, his survival and success against her destruction, symbolizes the gendered double standard of Hollywood. Carole was remembered as unstable, while Harrison was remembered as brilliant. The disparity speaks volumes about whose reputations were protected and whose were expendable. For the soldiers who loved her, however, Carole's memory never faded. Veterans continued to write about her in memoirs, describing how she lifted their spirits in the darkest moments of war. Some kept her photographs for decades, treasured reminders of the warmth she had brought into their lives. Unlike Hollywood, which reduced her to scandal, these men remembered the woman behind the glamour, the Carole who laughed with them, sang for them, and treated them with dignity. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in re-examining her story. Film historians and biographers have sought to reclaim her narrative from the tabloids, highlighting her achievements and resilience rather than just her death. Documentaries and retrospectives have begun to place her alongside other tragic figures of Hollywood's golden age, such as Judy Garland and Marilyn Monroe, not as curiosities, but as women whose struggles illuminate the darker truths of the industry. Carole Landis's legacy is also deeply personal. To those who knew her, she was remembered for her kindness and generosity. Friends described her as loyal, affectionate, and endlessly giving. She was the star who never acted superior, the actress who cared more about making others comfortable than about her own image. This humanity, so often hidden behind Hollywood's facade, is perhaps the most enduring part of her memory. Yet the open question remains: what might she have become if fate had been kinder? Carole was only 29 when she died, an age at which many actors are just beginning to find their stride. Had she been given more substantial roles, had she been treated with greater respect, she might have matured into one of Hollywood's great actresses. Her beauty, while undeniable, was matched by ambition and intelligence. She had dreams of writing, producing, and expanding her career beyond acting. Those dreams were cut short, leaving behind only the haunting possibility of what could have been. Her story also challenges the way we remember Hollywood's golden age. Too often, it is romanticized as a time of glamour and sophistication, when stars shone brighter than they do today. But Carole Landis's life reminds us that beneath the glitter was a system that exploited and discarded talent, particularly women. The tragedy of her death forces us to reckon with the human cost of those silver screen fantasies. Today, Carole Landis is sometimes called the Forgotten Angel of Hollywood. The title is both fitting and unjust. Fitting, because her beauty and kindness gave her an almost angelic quality. Unjust, because to forget her is to ignore the lessons her life offers. She should not be remembered only as a victim of love or scandal, but as a woman who gave everything she had, her talent, her time, her heart to the world around her. The open question, then, is not simply how Carole Landis died, but how we choose to remember her. Do we let her story remain buried in the gossip columns of 1948? Or do we reclaim her as a complex, courageous woman whose life, though brief, revealed both the brilliance and the brutality of Hollywood? In the end, Carole's legacy is a mirror. It reflects not only her beauty and tragedy, but also the industry and society that shaped her destiny. When we look at her story, we see the bright promise of stardom, the devastating costs of rejection, and the enduring need to value women not for their appearance, but for their humanity. Carole Landis's smile may have faded from the screen, but her story endures an unanswered question, a haunting reminder, and a plea not to forget the angel Hollywood once adored, then abandoned.